The silence between them was never empty. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the Lowe's Angels skyline, casting warm amber hues through the sprawling windows of the old cafe where time seemed to move at half its usual speed. Keanu Reeves sat alone at a corner table, half listening to the soft, jazz playing from the vinyl player in the corner, the scent of roasted coffee beans and nostalgia hanging thick in the air. He stirred his tea absently, his fingers moving with the same quiet grace that had followed him all his life, from movie sets to red carpets, from solitary bike rides to quiet corners like this. But his mind wasn't on the tea nor the setting sun. It was somewhere else entirely, or more accurately, with someone else. Sandra. There are people who walk into your life like lightning, brief, bright, and unforgettable. And then there are the ones who enter like a sunrise, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day you look around and realize they've filled every shadow in your world with light. Sandra Bullock had been that for Keanu. Not just a co-star, not just a friend. She had become the echo in his silences, the warmth in his coldest winters, the smile in every bittersweet memory. And even now, after all these years, even after the cameras had stopped rolling and the headlines had faded, the space she left behind had never truly been filled. He never let go, and perhaps he never wanted to. It had all begun innocently enough, the way most iconic stories do. A casting call, a script titled Speed, two rising stars who were worlds apart in personality but somehow completely in sync on screen. She was all fire and laughter, charm and chaos, while he was composed, introspective, a quiet soul navigating a noisy industry. Yet when the cameras started rolling, something unexplainable unfolded. It wasn't just chemistry. It was a kind of spiritual rhythm, a dance of emotions neither of them planned for, but both instinctively understood. Even the crew noticed it, the way Sandra would glance at him between takes, laughing at something he hadn't said out loud. The way Keanu always looked slightly more alive when she walked into the room, as if the gravity around him shifted to follow her. For the audience, it was movie magic. For them, it was something else, something real, something unspoken. But the timing, as it often is in life, was never right. After Speed, they drifted, as people in Hollywood often do, toward new projects, different circles, and the carefully constructed silence of polite distance. But Sandra stayed with him in ways no one else could. Every time he watched one of her interviews, every time her name appeared in a headline or her laugh echoed in an awards ceremony, something stirred inside him. He would never admit it publicly, not then. Perhaps not even to himself, but a part of him had always waited. Not for her to come back, not for some grand, romantic reunion, but just for clarity. For a moment where all the fragmented feelings might finally arrange themselves into something that made sense. Years passed, life happened, awards were won, loved ones were lost, rumors came and went as they always do, linking them with other people, painting stories in tabloids that never came close to the real, quiet truth, that Keanu and Sandra were never a scandal or a secret fling. They were something else entirely, something deeper, harder to define, impossible to replicate. A bond that didn't require dates or declarations, something carved in silence and respect. And yet, within that silence was a longing that refused to age. And then came the podcast. It was supposed to be a harmless reunion, a nostalgia-fueled episode where both stars would sit down with an old friend in the industry and talk about Speed 25 years later. Fans expected laughter, behind-the-scenes jokes, maybe a story or two about how the bus almost crashed for real. What they didn't expect, what no one did, was the moment when everything changed. When Keanu, for the first time, said something that silenced even Sandra. It happened halfway through the episode. The host had jokingly asked if the two had ever secretly dated, prompting polite chuckles and playful shrugs. But then, Sandra leaned forward with a grin and said, "You know, I actually had the biggest crush on you during filming, but I was sure you didn't feel the same way." The room went still. Keanu didn't laugh, he didn't deflect. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second it was as if every year between them collapsed. He exhaled slowly and said, voice barely above a whisper, "That's crazy, because I felt the same and I thought you didn't." There was no applause, no dramatic music, just silence. But it wasn't empty. It was full of all the words they never said, all the glances they never dared to interpret, all the moments that slipped past like sand through their fingers. Sandra's eyes welled up. Keanu looked away. And the world, listening through headphones and screens, realized they weren't hearing a Hollywood anecdote. They were witnessing a truth. That single exchange reignited everything, not just for fans, but for them. In the days that followed, Sandra sent him a message. Not long, just a few lines. But it ended with, I think it's time we stop being strangers to our own story." He didn't reply immediately. Keanu had always been careful with emotions, especially his own. But that message stayed with him. He would find himself reading it during long motorcycle rides through the hills or while staring at old film stills from Speed tucked inside his notebooks. It was a reminder that some connections don't expire. They evolve. They wait. And so he found himself here in the cafe they both used to frequent during their early shooting days. A small, quiet place far from the flashing lights. He wasn't sure if she'd show up, but she had said to meet here. "If we're going to talk," she had texted, "let it be where we didn't have to pretend." The bell above the door jingled, breaking his thoughts. Keanu looked up, and there she was, Sandra. Still radiant, still carrying the same effortless energy that had once lit up sets and hearts. Her eyes met his, and for the first time in years, there was no need for a script, no need for rehearsals. Just two souls walking toward the truth they had both tiptoed around for far too long. She sat down across from him, her hand brushing the old wood of the table as if anchoring herself in the moment. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," he replied. And then as the silence settled again, this time different, this time hopeful, Keanu finally said what he had kept inside for years. "I never let go, Sandra, because I never wanted to live in a world where you were just a memory." Her eyes filled, his voice didn't shake, and just like that, everything unsaid began to find its voice. The things they never said, and the one that changed everything. The weight of Keanu's words lingered in the space between them, as if the air itself had paused to listen. Sandra sat still for a moment, absorbing his confession, the subtle tremor in his tone betraying a lifetime of restraint. In the decades she had known him, through interviews, press junkets, award galas, and chance reunions, she had seen Keanu play 1,000 roles, wear 1,000 expressions. But never had she seen this version of him, raw, vulnerable, and disarmed by his own truth. It wasn't the confession of a man seeking romance. It was the quiet ache of someone who had lived too long with a story unresolved. She reached for her coffee cup more out of instinct than thirst, needing something to ground her as memories came rushing back, the long night shoots during Speed, when they'd share a trailer to keep warm from the unrelenting LA chill. The way Keanu used to leave folded origami birds on her chair, never explaining why, but always placing them after a difficult scene. The shared silences in makeup trailers where they didn't need to talk to understand each other. It had been magic, yes. But it had also been fleeting. Their rising careers, their guarded hearts, their deep respect for boundaries, all of it had kept them from acting on what was so clearly there. She hadn't planned to open that door again. Not really. Life had moved on. She had built a family, survived heartbreaks, endured the slow bruising of grief, and learned how to smile through it. Keanu, too, had known his share of sorrow. He had lost people he loved, carried burdens the world never truly saw behind his gentle demeanor. They had both become warriors of silence, kindred spirits who bore their pain privately, gracefully. And maybe, in some twisted, poetic way, that was why they had never come together. They were too similar in their solitude, too respectful to disturb the other's quiet. But time, as it always does, had its own agenda, and it was not done with them yet. Sandra looked up from her cup and met his gaze, eyes glistening. "Do you ever wonder," she began slowly, "what would have happened if one of us had just said it back then?" Keanu smiled, not with his mouth, but with that quiet glint in his eyes that always appeared when he was about to say something that mattered. "Every day," he replied. "But I think, if we'd said it then, we wouldn't have known what to do with it. We were still trying to become who we are now." She nodded. There was truth in that. In their youth, they had been stars pulled by the gravity of Hollywood, schedules, agents, and insecurities. Now they were people, real people, wiser, weathered, ready. "I watched you," Keanu continued, his voice low and deliberate, "all these years, from afar mostly. You were always brilliant, but not just on screen. The way you handled loss, the way you protected your kids, the way you laughed in interviews even when your eyes looked tired. You became someone I admired more with every year that passed, and I kept thinking maybe it's too late, maybe I missed my chance." Sandra's lips parted slightly, stunned not just by his words, but by the weight behind them. She'd spent years convincing herself that whatever they had back then was a sweet memory, a faded what-if. She had trained herself not to look for him in crowds, not to read too deeply into headlines, but deep down in the quietest part of her heart, she had always held a little space for him, for the way he made her feel seen, for the man who didn't just hear her words but listened between them. She reached into her purse, pulling out a small, creased photograph. It was from the wrap party of Speed. Someone had taken a candid shot of the two of them, Sandra laughing with her head thrown back, and Keanu looking at her with an expression so unmistakably tender it almost hurt to see it now. "I kept this," she said, sliding it across the table. "Not for the memory, but because I needed to remind myself it was real, that I didn't imagine the way you looked at me that night." Keanu picked up the photo gently, as if touching something sacred. His fingers lingered at the corner, tracing the edges like he was holding a moment frozen in amber. "You didn't imagine it," he whispered. "I was just too afraid to ruin the friendship. You meant too much to me." The cafe around them carried on, cups clinking, doors opening and closing, a child giggling near the counter, but in their corner it was as if time itself bowed out, giving them space. The world had always been loud for them, but this moment was carved in silence, one that didn't demand explanations, only honesty. Sandra leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything." "Why now?" Keanu looked at her, and for a long second the answer didn't come in words, but in a weary, soulful exhale. "Because I don't want to be 80, sitting on a porch somewhere, still wondering what might have happened if I just told you the truth. I've lost too many people without getting the chance to say what I really felt. I don't want to lose you that way." A lump rose in her throat. There it was again, his quiet, devastating honesty. He didn't try to charm her with grand gestures or scripted lines. He simply gave her the parts of himself that he had kept hidden, even from the world that adored him. He let her see the man behind the myth. And she realized then, in a way more profound than she ever had before, that it had never really been about timing, or even romance. It was about trust, about presence, about being the one person in someone's life who sees the pain and chooses to stay anyway. "I never stopped caring about you," Sandra said, her voice barely audible. "Even when I thought you moved on, even when I told myself it was all just in my head, there was always something unfinished." Keanu reached out, gently placing his hand over hers. No rush, no pressure, just a connection, warm, grounding, real. "Then maybe," he said, "we owe it to ourselves to see what it looks like finished." Tears welled in Sandra's eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming release of years of pretending, of hiding, of guarding. She nodded slowly. "Maybe we do." They didn't need to define anything that day. There were no promises made, no declarations shouted from rooftops. Just two people who had spent years circling each other in silence, finally choosing to walk the same path, even if just for a little while. And sometimes that's all a story needs to be reborn. As they stood to leave the cafe, Keanu glanced at the photograph once more, then carefully slid it into the inner pocket of his coat. It wasn't nostalgia anymore. It was a beginning. Outside, the sky had turned a soft gold, the horizon blushing with the final kiss of daylight. Keanu held the door open for her, and Sandra smiled as she stepped into the fading warmth. "So," she said, looking up at him, "what now?" He chuckled softly, slipping his hands into his coat pockets. "Now, we catch up, we go slow, and maybe we stop pretending we're just a good memory." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'd like that." And with that, they walked into the Lowe's Angels evening, not as co-stars, not as actors reuniting for a podcast, but as two souls who had finally said the words that had waited patiently in their hearts for years. The story wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. A door left open for decades. The days that followed were unlike anything either of them had experienced in a long time. There was no fanfare, no sudden splash in the tabloids, no announcement to the world that Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves were talking again. It wasn't for the world to know. It wasn't for the headlines or the interviews or the social media storm that would inevitably follow. It was quiet, purposeful, and deeply personal, the kind of reconnection that didn't happen over a single coffee or a shared laugh. This was something that had been waiting in the wings of their lives for decades, patient and persistent like a stubborn echo that never truly fades. Now that it had a voice again, it wasn't demanding. It was simply there, honest, familiar, and unshakable. Keanu had always lived life on the periphery of fame, a reluctant icon, a gentle soul in an industry of noise. And Sandra, despite her superstar status, was the same in many ways. She had built her fortress of authenticity through trials, heartbreaks, triumphs, and a careful balance between public life and private peace. Their bond had never been forged in the glitz of Hollywood. It had been formed in the quiet in-between moments, the 3 a.m. script rehearsals, the spontaneous motorcycle rides, the mutual understanding of how lonely success could feel when there was no one to share it with. And now, with the noise of youth behind them and the wisdom of experience in their hearts, they found themselves revisiting something fragile and beautiful, a connection they had once left untouched out of fear that touching it might break it. They met again 3 days after that cafe conversation, this time at Sandra's private residence in the hills, a space she rarely opened to anyone, not because she didn't trust, but because it was sacred. Her children's laughter had filled those rooms. Her tears had soaked the floorboards in moments of unbearable loss. It was her safe space, her world. And inviting Keanu into it wasn't just a gesture, it was a statement that he mattered. That what they were exploring now wasn't a whimsical return to a forgotten past, but an earnest look into what the future might still hold. He arrived with no fanfare, as always, just a motorcycle, a gentle knock, and that quiet aura of stillness that always surrounded him. Sandra opened the door barefoot, holding a cup of tea, her hair loosely tied, no makeup, no pretenses, just her. And Keanu, seeing her like that, felt something shift in him, a softness, a clarity. She had always been stunning on red carpets, yes, but this was different. This was real. And in that moment, he realized something simple and undeniable. He had never truly stopped caring, because the real her had always been his favorite version. They sat on her back porch as the late afternoon sun dipped behind the eucalyptus trees. Her dogs played nearby, occasionally wandering over to nuzzle Keanu, who greeted them with the same gentle reverence he gave everyone. They talked about everything, not just their past, but the lives they had lived apart. Sandra spoke of motherhood, of how the smallest moments with her children had reshaped her soul, of how losing her partner to illness had made her question the fairness of life, and how she had slowly stitched her heart back together with the thread of daily routines, unconditional love, and quiet strength. Keanu listened, not with the intention to respond, but with the full presence of someone who understood what it meant to carry invisible weights. When it was his turn, he spoke of the years he spent drifting between sets and solitude, of how acting had often been both a sanctuary and a prison, of how grief had made him more human, more observant, more him. He spoke of loneliness, but not with bitterness, with honesty. And Sandra, hearing him, didn't offer pity. She offered space. And in that space, Keanu found something he hadn't known he was still searching for: peace. As the sky turned a deeper shade of indigo and the first stars blinked into existence above them, Sandra got up and returned with a dusty old box, one she hadn't opened in years. Inside were relics of a different time: Polaroids from movie sets, ticket stubs from press tour, scribbled notes passed between takes. And among them, folded and yellowing with time, was a letter she had written but never sent. She handed it to him with a small, almost embarrassed laugh. "I wrote this the week after Speed wrapped. I never mailed it. Thought it was too much. Too soon. Too confusing, but I never threw it away either." Keanu took the letter with the reverence of someone holding a piece of someone's soul. He unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the handwriting that was so unmistakably hers, slightly tilted, thoughtful, full of character. The words hit him like waves. She had written of gratitude, admiration, and something deeper, a feeling she couldn't name at the time, but that pulsed through every line. She had written about how he made her feel safe in an industry that often felt like a performance both on and off camera. How he made her laugh when she wanted to cry. How being near him felt less like infatuation and more like home. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "You should have sent it," he said quietly. "I was scared," she admitted, "and I told myself if it was real, it would circle back around someday." He folded the letter gently, tucking it into the inside pocket of his jacket, beside the photograph from the cafe. Two artifacts from a love story that never got the chance to begin until now. They didn't kiss that night. They didn't fall into each other's arms like a scene from one of their films. What they shared was slower, more sacred. It was a long hug before he left, the kind where neither wanted to be the first to pull away. It was the way her hand lingered on his chest a second longer, and the way his fingers grazed her cheek in a silent promise that he wasn't going to disappear again. And it was the look they shared as he walked down her front steps, a look that said, this time, we're not running from this. Over the next few weeks, they became a fixture in each other's lives in ways that felt almost revolutionary for people who had spent so long pretending their bond was behind them. They attended small art exhibits together, hidden under hats and sunglasses, content just to walk side by side. Keanu invited her to watch him rehearse for a charity stage performance, something he hadn't done in years, and she sat in the back row, beaming, clapping louder than anyone else when he finished. She took him hiking with her children, and he surprised them by being hilariously terrible at trail snacks, but incredible at teaching them how to build a makeshift compass out of leaves and string. The press began to whisper, of course. Paparazzi snapped the occasional blurry photo, but neither of them confirmed anything. They didn't need to, because what they were building wasn't for headlines or clickbait, it was for them. A slow, honest, fragile unfolding of something too precious to exploit. And yet, amidst all the joy, there was still one question Sandra hadn't dared ask, the one that had haunted her for years. She waited until the next time they met at the cafe, their cafe, the one that had now become a ritual. As they sat sipping their usual drinks, watching the world go by through tall windows, she finally asked, "Why didn't you ever tell me, Keanu? Not during Speed, not after, not even when we were both single again." He was quiet for a long moment, then set his cup down and met her gaze with that disarming vulnerability that had become his trademark. "Because I didn't think I deserved to ask you for more than you were already giving," he said. "You were light and I was surviving. You were building and I was just trying not to fall apart. I didn't want to bring my storms into your sunshine." Her eyes shimmered, but this time not with pain, with understanding, with gratitude. "You were never a storm," she whispered. "You were the calm I didn't know I needed." And with that, something inside both of them shifted, not dramatically, but permanently. The past was no longer a haunting echo. It was a bridge, and they were finally walking across it. Healing in the light of what could have been. There are bonds that mend with time, like healed fractures that grow stronger at the broken places. And then there are connections like Sandra and Keanu's, not broken, just paused. A quiet melody that never ended, only faded into the background while life played louder songs. But now, as they walked side by side through the delicate quiet of their second chance, they began to understand that what they had shared wasn't something fragile that needed fixing. It was something rare that had never been fully lived. They had started meeting weekly, though neither called them dates. The world had grown used to their friendship, and so under the protective cloak of public familiarity, they moved through their rediscovery unseen, uninterrupted. Keanu took her to old bookstores in tucked-away neighborhoods, places where the smell of paper and time soaked into your soul. Sandra introduced him to her favorite hidden garden spots, where she used to take her children on days she needed to feel rooted. They made no declarations, they placed no labels, but with every shared silence, every unspoken gesture, a story bloomed between them, not of rekindled romance, but of something deeper, recognition. One morning, after a quiet walk in Griffith Park, Keanu drove her up the coast to a cliffside spot only he knew, a place he had discovered during a year of grieving. It wasn't famous, wasn't fenced or curated. Just a raw edge of land where the ocean roared against the rocks with the unfiltered passion of something ancient and unafraid. He had come there often after losing his daughter and later, the love of his life. It had become the place where he let his tears fall freely into the wind, where he spoke aloud the words he never dared say in the company of others. As they stood there, Sandra wrapped in a soft gray sweater and Keanu leaning quietly against his motorcycle, he told her about it. Not in detail, Keanu didn't do drama, but in the sparse, poetic way he always spoke when something mattered. He told her about the ache that never really left, the way grief changed a man's rhythm, made joy feel like something borrowed. He spoke of silence, not as emptiness, but as sanctuary. And she listened, not as a woman trying to rescue him, but as someone who knew that pain doesn't need fixing, only witnessing. She didn't say anything for a long time after he finished. Instead, she slipped her hand into his, fingers interlacing like puzzle pieces finally settling into place. The wind pulled at their hair, the sky stretching endlessly above them, and in that moment Keanu realized that he didn't have to carry it all alone anymore. That perhaps love wasn't about distraction or escape, but about accompaniment. A quiet promise that says, you don't have to walk through the fire by yourself. Later that evening, they sat on the steps of her porch, watching her children play in the distance, the sounds of laughter drifting toward them like music from another world. He had never met them before. It had taken her time. But something about the way Keanu held space, the way he didn't try to impress or perform, made her trust him with the most sacred parts of her life. And when her daughter shyly handed him a drawing of a dog on a motorcycle, Keanu had smiled so gently that Sandra felt her heart clench. He was good with them. Naturally, instinctively good. Not in a forced way, but in the way only a man who had loved and lost could be. Attentive, patient, present. That night, after the children were asleep and the stars littered the sky with careless brilliance, Sandra poured 2 glasses of wine and they sat under the string lights on the patio. Keanu leaned back, eyes half closed, absorbing the peace around him. And then he said something she wasn't expecting. "You know," he murmured, I used to think the universe kept us apart for a reason, that maybe we weren't meant to be more than what we were back then. Sandra looked at him, eyebrows raised. But now, he continued, now I think maybe we were just meant to find each other when we were ready to stay. The words struck something in her, a gentle chord that hummed in the quiet, because she had thought the same thing. There had been other loves, other tries, but they had always felt like rehearsals for something she couldn't name. With Keanu, it wasn't just about love. It was about knowing. That rare, electric feeling of being fully seen, fully understood, without the need for masks or explanations. She reached across the table and touched his hand, her voice barely above a whisper. Then maybe we don't waste this. Maybe we stop treating it like a maybe. Keanu's eyes met hers, soft and unreadable. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. There was no kiss, not yet. Just that moment heavy with truth, light with possibility. And for them, that was more than enough. But not everything could remain untouched by the outside world. The next morning, a photo leaked. It was a grainy image, Keanu holding Sandra's hand outside the bookstore. No faces, just body language, but the internet, ever hungry, pieced it together quickly. Within hours, the tabloids were ablaze. Are Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock Hollywood's next power couple? Reeves and Bullock reignite romance after 20 years. The headlines ranged from romantic to absurd, but they all had one thing in common. They shattered the sacred privacy the two had carefully built. Sandra's phone didn't stop buzzing. Her publicist panicked. The studio executives called with concerns about upcoming roles. And her heart, which had finally begun to open again, felt the old weight of scrutiny settle back in. Keanu, too, was flooded. Journalists called his team. Paparazzi followed him on his motorcycle, but what hurt most wasn't the noise, it was Sandra's silence. She didn't return his messages for 2 days, and when she finally did, it was a short one. Can we meet? They returned to the cafe, the one place that still felt like theirs. She was already there when he arrived, sunglasses on, her posture guarded. When he sat down, she took them off, and he could see it, the doubt creeping in, the fear that maybe this was all a beautiful mistake. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted. The spotlight, the questions, the pressure. Keanu nodded. He understood, too well. But he also knew this. Fear was always loudest when something mattered. You don't have to decide today, he said gently. But just know this, I'm not going anywhere, not this time. I've spent too many years letting the world make my choices for me. I won't let them take this from us too. Tears welled in her eyes and she looked away, trying to compose herself. I don't want to hurt my kids. I don't want to invite chaos into their lives. And you won't, he said firmly. I'm not asking to be a headline, I'm just asking to be here quietly, consistently with you. The sincerity in his voice broke something in her, the final wall, the last line of defense. Because he wasn't offering a love story for the cameras. He was offering presence. No conditions, no ultimatums, just him showing up. She reached across the table, took his hand and nodded. Okay, she whispered. We try slowly, carefully, but we try. And in that promise, fragile but fierce, they found their footing once again. What love looks like when no one's watching. The weeks that followed tested them in ways they hadn't anticipated. Fame, as both Keanu and Sandra had long known, was a silent shadow that never stopped following, even when you tried to outrun it with sincerity, quiet moments, and all the best intentions. Their story, which had taken years to unfold in private spaces of tenderness and trust, was now being devoured by headlines, dissected by entertainment panels, and reimagined by strangers who saw their connection as either a fairy tale or a PR stunt. But beyond the noise, beyond the swarming flashbulbs and speculative think pieces, there remained the simple truth that had brought them together. Love, in its purest form, asked only for honesty and presence. And in that quiet place, far from cameras and questions, Keanu and Sandra were building something unshakable. They didn't retreat from each other. If anything, the noise only solidified their resolve to protect what they had. Sandra, ever the fiercely private soul, made it clear to those around her that this wasn't a publicity stunt, wasn't a phase, and wasn't up for negotiation. Her inner circle, those closest to her, saw the shift almost instantly. Her eyes sparkled more often now. Her laughter was lighter, unforced. She moved through her days with a steadiness that only came from being emotionally anchored. And that anchor, more often than not, was Keanu, steady, unwavering, and present in a way that felt rare in a world of distractions. One rainy afternoon, after a particularly chaotic week of press and intrusion, Sandra found herself in her kitchen, barefoot, stirring a pot of soup, her son working on homework nearby, her daughter sketching quietly on the floor. Keanu was due to arrive any moment. He had promised to bring fresh bread from the bakery he loved, the one tucked into a quiet street on the east side that still used wood-fired ovens, and remembered his name without fanfare. When he finally walked in, soaked from the rain but smiling as though he'd just stepped out of sunlight, the entire house seemed to exhale. He kissed Sandra's cheek, set the warm loaf on the counter, and bent down to say hello to the kids, who now welcomed him not as a movie star but as someone who belonged. That evening was unremarkable by Hollywood standards. No gala, no interviews, no exclusive appearances. Just four people around a table, sharing bread and soup and stories. Keanu spoke softly about the books he was reading. Sandra teased him about his inability to pronounce French culinary terms. Her daughter giggled when Keanu tried to help with the dishes and dropped a spoon into the garbage disposal. And somewhere between the laughter and the quiet glances they exchanged, it became clear. This was what real love looked like. Not in the spotlight, not on the red carpet, but in the mess and magic of the everyday. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed and the dishes were done, they sat on the living room couch, wrapped in a shared blanket, a small fire crackling in the hearth. Rain tapped gently against the windows, and Keanu's arm was draped around her shoulders in the kind of embrace that said nothing but promised everything. Sandra leaned her head on his chest, her eyes half closed, lulled by the rhythm of his breathing. And then quietly she said, "I used to think love had to be big, loud, sweeping. Like the movies." Keanu chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And now I think love is about who stays when the cameras go away." He nodded, and for a moment neither spoke. The silence was full of gratitude, of presence, of all the things they no longer needed to say aloud. But even in this newfound peace, life, as it often does, had its own way of reminding them that love wasn't just about joy. It was also about choosing each other through the storm. It started with a call from Sandra's agent. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a lead role in a groundbreaking film set to shoot overseas, 6 months in Italy. A director she had always dreamed of working with, a role that would challenge her, redefine her. But the timing, it was impossible to ignore. Her kids had finally adjusted to routine. Her connection with Keanu had just begun to deepen. And part of her, the part that had waited years for this moment, felt paralyzed by the choice she now faced. She brought it up the next evening, hesitantly, during a walk through her neighborhood under the golden glow of streetlights. Keanu listened without interrupting, his face unreadable but calm. And he finally said when she finished, "I don't want to lose this," she whispered, "but I also can't let fear keep me from something I've waited so long to do." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Then don't." "But," he placed his hands gently on her shoulders. "Sandra, you've supported everyone around you for years. Your children, your friends, your fans, me. If this is something your soul has been waiting for, you owe it to yourself to go. I'll be here." Her eyes searched his face, looking for doubt, fear, resentment, anything that would betray the kindness in his words. But all she found was sincerity. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure." And so, with his blessing and her courage, Sandra packed her bags. The kids stayed with her sister for the first month while she settled in. Keanu helped her prepare, never once making her feel guilty, never once questioning her decision. He flew out to visit when he could, sometimes staying a weekend, sometimes only long enough to share a bottle of wine and a long hug before flying back. They FaceTimed. They sent letters, handwritten ones, because Sandra believed some words deserved ink, not emojis. And with each day, despite the distance, their bond grew stronger. One night, halfway through the shoot, Sandra called him in tears. It had been a grueling day. A scene had brought up emotions she wasn't ready to face. She felt exhausted, alone. And without hesitation, Keanu booked the first flight out. He arrived less than 24 hours later, unshaven, jet-lagged, but calm. He didn't try to fix anything. He just held her, made her tea, watched the sunrise with her on the balcony. And when she asked him why he came so quickly, he smiled and said, "Because the world can wait. You can't." That was the moment she knew, not just that he loved her, but that he was home. They never needed a proposal, never staged a red carpet reveal. What they had didn't need to be documented to be real. But when the shoot finally ended and Sandra returned home, stepping into her house with the familiar scent of lavender and wood, she found something waiting on her kitchen counter. Not a ring, not flowers, not a grand gesture. just a simple envelope with her name on it. Inside was a note in Keanu's handwriting. "You don't have to go through life wondering anymore. I'm here, all in. No timelines, no demands, just love. K." She clutched the note to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks. Because in a world that often demanded noise, she had found someone who spoke in whispers and meant every word. The quiet forever they built together. The house was quiet that morning, not silent in the way of absence, but quiet in the way that comes when every space feels filled with presence. The soft hum of the kettle warming in the kitchen, the rustling of leaves outside the living room windows, the muffled patter of a child's footsteps down the hallway, all of it part of the gentle symphony that had become Sandra and Keanu's life together. It had been a year since she returned from Italy. A year of ordinary days wrapped in extraordinary grace. A year of healing, learning, growing, not as actors, not as public figures, but simply as people choosing each other again and again. It wasn't always easy. There were disagreements, days of fatigue, pressures from their careers, challenges from blending families and pasts that still carried weight. But through it all, one truth had held them steady. They were no longer afraid to be seen, not by the world, but by each other. That morning, Keanu was sitting on the back porch, legs stretched out, a paperback novel resting on his chest unopened, his eyes gazing out at the garden. Sandra stepped out with 2 cups of coffee, her hair messy, her expression soft from sleep. She handed him a mug and sat beside him without a word, their knees touching, a shared silence forming like a blanket around them. After a moment, she leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, and he turned slightly to kiss her forehead, a gesture that had become a habit, one that said, "I see you. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." "I got a call this morning," she said finally, her voice low. Keanu glanced down at her, his brow lifting slightly. "A producer I worked with a few years back. They're putting together a film, something special. Real, intimate. They want us, you and me, to star together again." His gaze didn't change. No excitement, no concern, just curiosity. "What's it about?" he asked. She took a breath. 2 people, friends who never crossed the line until life gave them a second chance, and they finally took it. He let out a quiet laugh, more of an exhale really. "Sounds familiar." "They wrote it with us in mind," she added, then paused, watching his reaction. "I told them we'd talk." Keanu looked out over the garden again, watching a hummingbird flit near the lavender bushes, its wings invisible in motion. After a long moment, he said, "If we do this, it can't be for them. It has to be for us, for the story we never got to tell." Sandra nodded, "Exactly what I was thinking." And just like that, another chapter began to unfold, not on screen yet, but in their hearts, because something had shifted in both of them. For years, their love had lived in the shadows of fear, timing, missed chances. But now it existed in full light, not performative, not dramatic, but real, raw, lived in. And that reality had a way of bleeding into everything, their art, their parenting, their friendships. The people around them noticed. Directors who had worked with both of them separately would later speak about the shift, how they moved in sync now without trying, how their presence together made rooms feel softer, safer. The movie eventually happened, shot over several months in a quiet coastal town that mirrored their energy. The script was minimal, the budget small, but what they brought to it couldn't be bought. On set, there were moments when the lines blurred, when the characters bled into real life. A scene where she sat beside him on a porch, confessing how long she had waited for someone to understand her, left the crew stunned, because the tears on her face weren't from the script. They were Sandra's own. Another scene in which Keanu's character admitted he had spent his life looking for someone who felt like a safe silence wasn't in the original dialogue. He had added it. And when the director asked later if it was improv or memory, Keanu simply smiled and said, "Both." The film premiered quietly at a festival. No splashy Hollywood launch, just a modest theater filled with people who came to feel something real. The standing ovation at the end wasn't for the performance alone. It was for the truth woven into every frame, for the love that radiated between them, unpolished, unhidden, finally allowed to breathe. Critics called it a masterclass in restraint and connection. Fans wept. Not because they were seeing 2 beloved stars on screen, but because they were witnessing something that had taken a lifetime to reach its full bloom. But what mattered most wasn't the acclaim, it was what happened after. They returned home to their quiet life. Keanu continued his writing projects, occasionally doing indie films that fed his soul. Sandra, for the first time in years, took an extended break, not out of exhaustion, but contentment. They traveled not to escape, but to explore. They went to Kyoto in spring to walk among cherry blossoms, took road trips with the kids, spent afternoons volunteering at a children's art center in Los Angeles. They didn't post, they didn't announce, they simply lived. One autumn afternoon, as golden leaves fluttered across their backyard, Keanu handed Sandra a leather-bound notebook. "What's this?" she asked, running her fingers over the cover. "It's us," he said. "Everything I couldn't say over the years, I wrote it down for you, for someday." She opened it and read the first line. "The first time I knew I loved you, you were laughing at something that wasn't funny, but your laughter made the world feel like it was." She didn't cry, she smiled, because some love stories aren't meant to burn fast and fade. Some are slow embers that warm you from the inside out, lasting through every season. Later that evening, as they sat by the fire with the kids nearby, one sketching, the other lost in a book, Sandra reached over, lacing her fingers with Keanu's. He looked at her, and in that glance, the entirety of their journey flashed like a silent reel. The missed chances, the quiet longing, the rediscovery, the choosing. Always the choosing. "I'm glad we waited," she said. "Me too," he whispered, "because now we know." She rested her head on his shoulder as the fire cracked and danced. And in the stillness of that moment, no cameras, no scripts, no expectations, the truth of their love settled into the walls around them, into the very floor beneath their feet. They had finally let go of the past, not by forgetting it, but by honoring it. And in doing so, they had written the greatest story of all, not one of fame or fantasy, but of two souls who met, paused, and then, when the time was right, walked each other home. The end.